The nights are drawing in. Everybody's sick. It's time to do another podcast.
I would say past time.
It's past time,
Past
yeah.
time.
We already pre-trailed this one for people who listen to the bonus episodes, but we're going to do a show, or possibly two shows, depending on how long we talk for, on Delirious New York, the celebrated first book by the architect Rem Koolhaas.
It is just by him officially, isn't it?
It's just
he has
by him.
heavily acknowledged
Yeah,
assistance.
Yes, there are quite a few. There are quite a few other people involved, and we can unpick quite a lot of that. And I think also there are some important sounding boards and some important people whose ideas he's bouncing off.
Yeah.
But all of that is part of the story. This podcast is called About Buildings and Cities. I'm Luke Jones.
I'm George Kinjal.
Thanks for joining us. Who knows which number of episode this is, but it's quite high.
Over 100.
Over 100.
But low over 100. We had 2 million listens.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. So...
Well, this is an interesting topic. So it's Delirious New York, which came out in 1978 and was based on Rem Koolhaas's and other people's work for the preceding, well, probably 4 or 5 years, something like that. It's a very famous work. I hadn't read it before. I guess you probably had.
Yeah, I definitely read it at university, and I remember really enjoying it. Rem is one of the great characters of architecture. I would say in the post-Le Corbusier era, he's kind of as much the main character of architectural discourse as anyone is, really. And he projects that character through, but his built work, but particularly through his writing, which is his kind of way of framing what his work is and what it's all about, really. And to summarise what Delirious New York is, it claims to be a retroactive manifesto for Manhattan. That's the framing which it gives itself. And what it actually is a kind of episodic, idiosyncratic history of a kind of Manhattan, which touches on different eras, but the focus of which is a little bit right at the end of the 19th century and about the first third of the 20th century. Broadly, the coming of age of the skyscraper, or that's certainly the kind of culmination of the book as a phenomenon, and how it is that this kind of unique and extraordinary urban condition, which is Manhattan, comes to be. And what are some ways that architects specifically should think about what New York architecture really is? So, the idea of the retroactive manifesto is New York architecture is built by people who weren't very interested in theorizing very much about what they were doing, but that it contains a whole series of implicit principles, and that those are the ones which he's kind of setting out or claiming to set out to explain and to illustrate in the book. And so although it's technically a history book, you can't really, if you treat it really as a history book, you will start to pick enormous holes in it all over the place, and that's not the best way of looking at it.
It's not a history book in two ways. It's not at all comprehensive. It's extremely partial in terms of the things it looks at, and it's also extremely partial in its sourcing.
So just to say, should we say something about the Koolhaas trajectory? He'd been at the AA in the 60s, and then I think kind of graduated around 1970-ish, I think. Don't know.
Yeah, the earliest date you see on his project is 1969, and then, which is this Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, Let's Build the Berlin Wall.
No, they're two different things. So the 69 is his thesis project, which is the Berlin Wall as architecture.
Yeah.
And then Voluntary Prisoners was a kind of adaptation of it in 1971, which was for a Casabella competition.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of, I think we'll probably talk about it's a weird project, and I think we might talk about it on the bonus.
I think we have spoken about it before, but we can speak about it again.
It's very peculiar, but let's look at that one. It's funny, he was obviously working very hard and doing lots of things, and Voluntary Prisoners, and then later kind of edits what he wants to present of his career. And Voluntary Prisoners is one of the ones which kind of makes the cut in his later retrospective SML-XL, and he obviously thinks that it kind of got to got to the heart of something important. He also, like, in the internet's full of like early ephemera. And one is, there's an interesting lecture that he gave on Russian utopian architecture of the 20s, which you can see, it's on YouTube, which is, I think, is given to an audience of AA students, possibly when he was teaching there. And particularly, he talks about Ivan Leonidov's scheme competition proposal for Magnitogorsk, which was to be a new industrial city built on a linear model. And it's interesting that he's a very engaging lecturer, but also the sort of spin he puts on it in the lecture is really interesting to me, because like the linear city can be about all kinds of things. Like it's sort of an attempt to completely abolish the geography of the city as an impediment to creating a classless society.
Well, that's one thing it can be.
For him,
they're always city as diagram.
Yeah, for him, what he really focuses on is that the scheme is full of these like athletics tracks, and the flats have all got like bathrooms and showers, and his kind of gloss on it is all about the like enjoyment of like physical activity and pleasure. It's like a very hedonistic reading of, I think, what is often understood in quite a kind of like conceptual and abstruse sort of way. It's extremely like embodied, and it's extremely about like enjoyment, and this kind of, I find that kind of interesting. And then he did, I think partly this book was written while he was working with the architect O.M. Ungers at Cornell. And I believe that when they were there, they were actually working on this project about Berlin, which is, I might be mangling that, but anyway, this is a project which they did together called Berlin Green Archipelago, which is kind of a project about the problem of Berlin as a shrinking city. So at that time, we should say West Berlin, at that is what they were talking about, which at that time it is like a political island inside the German Democratic Republic, and had been very heavily bombed and was like significantly depopulated. And their kind of proposal in the bits that I've seen of it is about kind of condensing, making it almost like a kind of like nodal network of these slightly historicized, like in terms of their like urban form, like villages or towns, kind of condensing, compressing, creating this like intensified urbanity in these physical kind of islands within a sort of green network. So it's very much like a slightly postmodern spin on the classically like modernist vision of the future city as being a kind of green landscape with these towers and other things in it, the radiant city and all that kind of thing. So New York, it's a large city on the eastern coast of the United States of America, which is a country that you might have heard of. The intro of the book basically does it like it gives you like a few important episodes in the history of,
and also in the evolution of a particular type of idea of New York. So it's not just the history of the city.
Yeah, it obviously, like, New York was founded by the Dutch and then latterly taken over by the English and renamed. And the earliest sort of artifact of the idea of New York, which he presents, is this like bird's eye plan of New Amsterdam as was, which he notes is like a complete fabrication, which doesn't seem to have. I don't know if this is like a historically valid reading, but he's proposes that this plan is just completely made up and it's just an image to sell to people in Europe.
Yeah, a more energetic set of reviewers could have gone through. He makes quite a number of historical assertions, which feel often sketchy, but I haven't worked out whether they're true.
We're not fact checkers. That's not.
And this is the first one, which is, he essentially says this is a map, not of New Amsterdam, which it purports to be, but of as people wanted New Amsterdam to be.
Yeah.
And it looks like a large, prosperous European city. It's covered in hills.
Yeah.
It also is, presumably it's notionally the tip of Manhattan, but the bottom of the image is sea, and then above that is land.
I'm broadly, prepared to believe this this reading. I think
I was sort of suggesting there are things about it which don't immediately lend itself to seeming like the city as it's known today.
For him, it's really important, really, really believing in something and kind of making it come true through sheer like fantasy and sort of bloody mindedness.
Yeah,
that's one of his key ideas.
Like, okay, this is what they wanted it to be like, so this is what they were going to make it like.
So here's a little early quote, which I think also like shows a little bit of the tone that I was talking about. In 1626, Peter Minuit buys the island Manhattan for $24 from, in quotation marks, the Indians. But the transaction is a falsehood. The sellers do not own the property. They do not even live there. They are just visiting. In 1807, Simeon DeWitt, Governor Morris, and John Rutherford are commissioned to design the model that will regulate the final and conclusive occupancy of Manhattan. Very quickly, it segues to this like great event in the history of New York urbanism, which is the laying out of the grid, which was done at the beginning of the 19th century. Not uniquely, but very remarkably, is like it's very optimistic about how much the city is going to grow and how much it's going to continue growing. So the time that it's planned out, the city is really this very tiny bit right at the bottom. Like most of the grid is most of its farms. Again, is this next episode in this history of dreaming big, being audacious. He calls it the most courageous act of prediction in Western civilization. Essentially, like its function is to make it easier to buy and sell property, to kind of work out what people have and like to lay things out and have a kind of way of packaging it all up. The other thing about it is also there is a text which accompanies the commissioner's report, which proposes this grid, which he does a little bit of kind of close reading of. They essentially say, some people might say that we need to put in lots of parks and have kind of spacious boulevards and maybe big circuses and things, and in general follow a bit more of a French sort of model. But because we've got such a big river next to us, we don't need all of that. We can just be extremely pragmatic. And this like extreme kind of pragmatism is another. Extreme pragmatism is like another thematic of the kind of Manhattanism as ideology. In the way that he wants to characterize it, when people say they're being extremely pragmatic, often he thinks they're secretly doing something extremely utopian and actually like extremely kind of fantastical.
Yes, it's the inversion of, he likes to see it as a sort of inversion of how I guess he sees modernist theory, which is that you propose something extremely theoretical and then kind of work back from that.
Yeah.
And he sees the way that Manhattan works out as you enact something in a utopian spirit, justifying it on purely practical grounds.
Yeah.
Like as if you can't say, as if it's forbidden to say, we are doing this for beauty and spirit.
Yeah. So let me just read this little quote. The grid is, above all, a conceptual speculation. In spite of its apparent neutrality, it implies an intellectual program for the island. In its indifference to topography, to what exists, it claims the superiority of mental construction over reality. The plotting of its streets and blocks announces that the subjugation, if not obliteration, of nature is its true ambition. All blocks are the same. Their equivalence invalidates at once all the systems of articulation and differentiation that have guided the design of traditional cities. The grid makes the history of architecture and all previous lessons of urbanism irrelevant. It forces Manhattan's builders to develop a new system of formal values, to invent strategies for the distinction of one block from another. The grid's two-dimensional discipline also creates undreamt of freedom for three-dimensional anarchy. With its imposition, Manhattan is forever immunized against any further totalitarian intervention. In the single block, the largest possible area that can fall under architectural control, it develops a maximum unit of the urbanistic ego.
Okay, so there he's contending
that,
firstly, this is a utopian project, conquer nature by applying a grid to a city. Okay, sure. I mean, people have been doing that, I would say, at this point in history for 5,000 years.
Yeah.
But certainly uncontroversially for 2,500 years by that point. Fine, there are some different things, which is that they lay out all of the land on the island in this grid.
Yeah.
And that this, doesn't say entirely whether this is intentional or not, means that it's kind of democratic because you don't have any Beaux-Arts interventions, you don't have any great cut-throughs, you can't have any vast palaces, you can't have any vast...
Yeah. I mean, this is all a little bit before the kind of great Beaux-Arts like planning of the 19th century, but yeah, that at the core of it, there is like a real observation, which is that it's an unhierarchical plan, and it's one that it's extremely, I don't know, is it even pragmatic? It's extremely like
literal,
sort of mercantile.
It's very literal.
Value for money.
I guess you've got a thing that runs through the book, which is that he is enjoying doing close readings, and there's lots of close readings, and does them in a paranoid way, where he obviously takes the close reading further than there's stuff to go. Than there's like evidence for. And like, then, we don't have it. I mean, definitely that whole. You're not quite sure with all the things he's ascribing, in terms of. To all the things that he's saying are good about the grid, you're not quite sure where he thinks the intention stopped and what he thinks is coincidental. It seems very unlikely to me that... I mean, I don't think even Rem Koolhaas would defend the line that this grid is there to prevent a future sort of architecture from existing. It's kind of like that all the way through. He reads in an increasingly paranoid or detailed sense, closer and closer reading, to provide a sort of spiritual core. And I guess you just have to do what you want with that. But it's at one level, his propositions are slightly absurd, and at the other level, they're provocational. Okay, sure. Okay, that's that and it's all over quite quickly as well. Which
it's all kind of you either like this kind of stuff or you don't. I really enjoy it. This as you say, like paranoid, totally over the top reading. And then the other thing which is doing obviously is this is what the architects of things like the Radiant City or the Linear City said they were doing. And his kind of subversion is that actually this is what Manhattan was really doing. They just weren't talking about it.
Well, I mean, he says a retrospective manifesto, right? Yeah. So he's writing their intentions for them.
That's exactly it, yeah. And then he has a little bit on Central Park, which was kind of grafted into the grid about 40, 50 years later, when they realised, wow, this might actually get built up.
Also, it's when parks were becoming fashionable.
Then the kind of sort of close of the introduction is this little exploration of the first New York World's Fair in 1853, which was their kind of, they had a little sort of version of the Crystal Palace, and they had this big needle-shaped tower called the Latin Observatory. And there is this celebrated event, which is the unveiling of Elisha Otis's lift, where he did...
safety elevator.
The safety elevator. He did this it's one of the great pieces of... it's one of the great project launches of all time, isn't it? The here's my elevator, I'm going to cut the cable and it doesn't fall down. Which obviously sets the stage for the possibility of having buildings which are bigger than you might want to walk up the stairs to. He kind of observes also that the 1863 World's Fair and the probably better remembered 1939 World's Fair share this iconography of a big needle and a big round, like a big sphere, big round thing, which he endows with...
I would say mystical properties.
Yeah, they're kind of symbol. There's a symbolization.
He talks about it as if it's like the orb and rod of some monarch or something.
Well, it's a symbolization, isn't it? It's a symbolization of. He kind of glosses it as a symbolization of the two things that New York architecture is going to reach towards, which are being as high as possible and also containing as much as possible, which obviously are the properties of the needle and the sphere.
I think the things that we said about the first thing, you can say about the second thing.
Yeah.
You can imbue the sphere and the tower.
Yeah.
And the idea that the tower has no volume and lots of height,
Yeah.
and the sphere has the maximum amount of volume.
Yeah.
And then you can sort of describe these as special things, and then say
Yeah.
they have a special spiritual significance. But it's projection, right? Like,
I don't know
and-
spiritual, but yeah, they're like they're like
Okay.
kind of conceptual. They're like ideal. They're
Yeah, well,
they're like metaphysical, I would say,
Yeah,
more than
okay.
spiritual.
Yeah,
But
okay, like
Yeah.
geistig.
yeah,
But whatever.
Yeah.
And there's a picture which is a literal projection
yeah, of one onto
of
the
one
other.
onto the other.
Yeah.
Something we'll see going through is that there's a quality in the images and there's a quality in the paintings, which is that they are taking reference images and kind of recontextualizing them, or like putting, like, very few images come from nothing, but they're all radically reassembled or repurposed.
So the first chapter, and really where he wants to locate the start of Manhattanism, is actually not on the island at all, but just round the corner at the entrance of New York Harbour on Coney Island, which is, I mean, it's not even really an island to start off with, but they turn it into an island by digging a canal. And it was initially, in the early 19th century, a kind of popular place to go for like a picnic out in unspoilt nature. And then latterly a kind of place with resort hotels for the better sort of person. And then with the arrival of the railway, turns into a mass resort. And what he's really interested in is the development of these three great kind of early funfair theme parks in right at the end of the 19th century, which are Steeplechase Park, Luna Park, and Dreamland. The subtitle of the chapter is The Technology of the Fantastic. And it's kind of about the simultaneous development of like architectural and experiential fantasy and the possibility of experiencing all kinds of crazy and hitherto undreamt of things, but also with the integration of things that are being, you know, the newest technology and things that are being developed of all kinds.
Tone, I don't think we've spoken about enough. This copy of the book that I've got is not a very good one. There's different editions, and we don't have the original.
The original
which
one is quite expensive.
It's quite expensive, and the layout, but the layout is better.
Yeah. They used to have a first edition of it in the library at UCL, but a member of staff stole it.
We'll see them in hell.
Looking down through the little... yes.
You may
From
be a
looking
bundle.
down from Calvinist heaven. Yeah.
Yes, I'm not sure about that, but we shall see. But it's not the tone. I mean, the tone here is quite strange. Coney Island is the fetal Manhattan.
He describes Coney Island as a clitoral appendage.
Yeah, I thought that. Through the book, actually, the kind of sexual metaphors.
Yeah.
Well, he kind of. I guess if you want to turn up the volume on your metaphors,
yes,
that's one direction.
A
you can
clitoral
go in.
appendage at the mouth of New York's natural harbour. Or what's the other one? Yeah. It's a fetal Manhattan. They're all like they're aphorisms. He obviously has a gift with language, like that's part of his thing, and he is kind of constantly provoking and constantly kind of creating these like engaging and seductive sort of taglines.
But also
for things.
hopelessly over the top.
They
and like
are
sort of
so
silly.
far beyond over the top.
Yeah. Coney Island is sort of described as if it is a psychosexual expansion of a sort of schizophrenic city.
Yeah.
Like, the nature of the heart of the city is insane, and it throws out energy of masses washed up upon the shore of this clitoral appendage of...
Yeah.
Okay.
So here's a description of the railway reaching Coney Island. It says tracks. They're all these like short paragraphs with like a title. Tracks. The battle becomes critical when the first railroad reaches the middle of the island in 1865, its tracks stopping dead at the surf line. The trains put the oceanfront finally within the reach of the new metropolitan masses. The beach becomes the finish line for a weekly exodus that has the urgency of a jailbreak. But the need for pleasure dominates. The middle zone develops its own magnetism, attracting a range of special facilities to provide entertainment on a scale commensurate with the demand of the masses, in a laughing mirror image of the seriousness with which the rest of the world is obsessed with progress. Coney Island attacks the problem of pleasure, often with the same technological means.
Yeah, it's got a bit of like high-fluting, ridiculous prose. It's also got a bit, I thought, of the like super positive American voiceover like propaganda film. You know, like around the kind of New Deal and Second World War.
Yeah.
Like, future is this thing.
Yeah.
Now, 10,000 of these.
So the chapter like details like a lot of these pleasure apparatuses, doesn't it? There's the barrels of love, the tunnel of love, shoot the chutes. The barrels of love are like big rotating cylinders where you go in and fall over on top of each other, and they make a mechanical steeplechase where you can ride a mechanical horse around what looks like a very long track. In fact, there's a very early water slide where you all go down.
In fact, a whole succession of them.
Yeah, this seems to be one of the most enduring ones. The shoot the chutes.
Well, they're all called shoot the chutes.
Yeah, shoot the chutes. There are multiple shoots. Shoots
Shoots the shot.
Shoots the shot. Yeah,
It's a log flume.
Big, yeah, but in like quite a big boat, I think.
I would say this section describes the thing that's kind of at its core is that there are a number of entrepreneurs on sites competing
Yeah,
with to provide on this like former kind of parkland at the beach cheap thrills.
yeah,
And they're operating. There's a railway that comes in. And it really feels a bit like, Sim theme park or something. They're all right next to each other. And so there is a rapid one-upmanship of different attractions.
yeah,
Things that can attract people from the city. And there are mechanical rides. There are architectural fantasies. Lots of towers made of papier-mâché and cardboard.
yeah,
Performances. And they're sort of trying to work out, they've got the first roller coasters and things. They're evolving what a theme park is. And there are also things that are not so present in a contemporary theme park. Midget villages, rooms where they would incubate premature children was a popular attraction.
yeah. I'm not sure he talks about it, but I think in Luna Park, they had an elephant. I can't remember what it did.
He does mention it, yes.
Where they execute the elephant for they stage the execution of the elephant as an attraction. I can't remember what they decide to execute it for. It's committed some kind of crime.
So the tone is of this place is very strange.
I mean, yeah,
and lively, and at the same sense, it's definitely immensely like the description of this comparatively short period of time.
Yeah.
Really, I would say it's the 10 years before the First World War and a little bit beyond that, maybe.
Yeah.
As the kind of heyday of these competing attractions, which blend a number of things that Rem Koolhaas is very in favour of, such as diversity, concentration, technology.
Yeah.
It's all about the new electric light, flimsiness, theatricality.
Novelty above all, novel experiences and the application of like imagination to the creation of totally novel sort of spaces and experiences for the people to enjoy. The kind of the chronology that he relates is like there's the first park which kind of arises a bit organically, and then there are two which follow it which are built kind of as a whole with a cohesive concept. So Steeplechase Park is the first one. There's Luna Park, which is where there's a whole kind of fantasy concept where it's actually a city on the moon, and they really push the boat out with these like hundreds of little kind of decorative towers. And then there's Dreamland, which is I can't remember. I mean, Dreamland I think has lots of.
Well, I think he describes the themes as if they were very rigorously applied, but in fact, Dreamland has a sort of slightly sea theme.
Yeah.
But really, the theme of all of them is sort of fantasism, and the park itself are fairly architecturally simple. They're often basically a kind of they're more simple, I would say, than a modern theme park.
Yeah.
And they're smaller.
Yeah.
It's almost like a U.
Yeah.
With the beach at one end with a couple of pleasure piers.
Yeah.
And then around the edge of the U are different attractions.
Yeah.
So you've got a roller coaster, premature babies to look at.
Rather prophetically, in Dreamland, you can go and watch firemen fighting a staged fire.
Yes, you can also watch biblical creation.
Yeah. Yes, or the country where everyone is a dwarf.
Really weird.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he concentrates on some aspects of it. I mean, the thing that strikes me is it's a very tabloid sensibility, isn't it?
What, the... I mean, they're for the masses.
Yeah.
They're fun. There's a big building built like an elephant. I don't even know where that was. The other thing which he kind of stresses is, like electricity comes in during this period, and they bring in, they like floodlight the beach so that you can swim all night, and they have these incredible light shows or kind of light displays. And all of these were essentially destroyed in pretty short order. Dreamland burnt down. Luna Park.
Steeplechase Park carried on for quite a long time, I think.
Yeah.
But the other two...
were gone, certainly completely gone.
Early 20s.
Yeah. And a lot of what was left was kind of erased and prettified in the early sort of post-war period. But so for him, it's the technology of the fantastic. What does the technology of the fantastic mean? It means you've got technology, you've got... I mean, one of the things he's really interested... He like sort of spins about the theme parks is that they tend to have kind of a grid. They tend to have like a kind of technological infrastructure which looks a lot more like a modern building. They'll have their own telephone exchange. They'll have a kind of electrical grid. They'll have lots of sort of mechanical ways for doing various things. As a theme park has to have, you have to have a sort of infrastructure to support these enormous numbers of people and to kind of get people moving through the rides and things like that. But which for him is sort of prophetic of the skyscraper and kind of later massive modern buildings.
There's also a lot of showmanship.
Yeah.
So later on in the skyscraper, there's a lot of there's a lot of selling in real estate, isn't there?
Yeah.
But there's even more direct selling in selling an attraction. You really have to grab people's attention.
Yeah.
And the great speed of the rise and fall of these things is interesting too. I can see how Coney Island is very exciting for Rem Koolhaas, who likes contradiction, density, all these things. And then we have to kind of disentangle exactly how it fits into this work on New York.
Yeah, well, so it's certainly in his manifesto, Coney Island is the ingredients of the skyscraper laid out in a big sort of flat area.
Yeah, and that tells you that his idea of a skyscraper is possibly more exciting than you would initially think from looking at those sterile corporate plazas.
Oh yeah, we'll get to that though. And then he has a sort of bridging project, which is this weird proposal someone was making to make like an enormous ball-shaped building, which seems like a kind of pyramid scheme or something. They were raising a lot of...
I think it's not a pyramid scheme.
It's a fraud. It's a fraud. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
It's a scheme whereby it's one of the... Before Mr. Ponzi invented a new way of doing a fraud, and before the invention of like multi-level marketing, you could just have a fraud where you said, give us all your money, we'll give you loads more money back by this project.
We're going to build this project.
And you just take the money and you go away. You don't have a pyramid.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's what it is. But it does...
Speculative fraud.
It does generate some kind of quite interesting visuals. This is an enormous globe-shaped, kind of vaguely Eiffel Tower-like building in the middle of the city.
And he produces some theory about... This is another one of his globes. And he likes the idea of the...
Yeah.
I think something that he likes is that the sphere is both notionally super practical because it's got the largest internal volume and architecturally absurd.
Yeah.
As a building form. Sphere is like the most rhetorical and unactually useful architectural shape.
Yeah.
You can imagine.
Yeah.
What do you put on the inside of a sphere? I mean...
People, throughout history, architects keep falling in love with it and trying to make it happen. And it's never any good for anything. But
Yeah.
But it is very striking. It's so big and conceptual.
So
He says the Globe Tower, it's the essence of the skyscraper to reproduce the Earth and create other worlds. So
again, you've got this like slightly febrile voice of Rem, picking up what is a couple of slightly silly images for a I mean, yeah, good
But
on
this
him.
this is a classic thing to like take like this sort of this strange and ultimately of very little consequence kind of moment in not even really architecture, like kind of real estate speculation, and give it the kind of conceptualization and sort of theory heft that people have traditionally endowed, like
But, I mean,
Ludwig Hilbersheimer or Le Corbusier with.
That's it. I mean, one of the great moves in this is to say that the real hucksters and charlatans aren't fraudsters and like property pump and dumpers.
Yeah.
It's European modernists.
Yeah.
And actually, the real truth of theory is in fraudsters and property speculators.
The real beautiful souls. Yeah.
Yeah. To invert these two things, and that's the kind of the game.
Yeah. It's fun. I mean, there's bits that I don't think we've got time to talk about. There's a good bit. I enjoyed the bit where there's a long bit on Gorky going to visit Coney Island as a like socialist correspondent and being horrified by anything. And I think that, something that's going on in the book is like there's a lot of sort of subtextual needling people that Koolhaas thinks are annoying. And one of the groups of people he thinks are annoying are like Marxist architectural historians. I kind of think that this is...
And the European avant-garde in general.
they're...
and they are annoying.
He's kind of... There's a sort of...
But he can be annoying too.
We're not here to judge who's annoying and who's not. Like,
it's okay to be annoying sometimes.
Yeah. So there's a certain amount of that going on. Anyway, right.
Yes, but I mean, that's... It's a kind of echo of what we're going to see in the future, isn't it? Gorky goes to Coney Island and doesn't like it. Well, I mean, I don't think it's really for him. I don't think it's really for us either.
Yeah. So the skyscraper, the kind of tagline for which is the double life of utopia.
Now, I had a question. You might know more about this. My feeling is an awful lot has been written about the origin of the skyscraper.
Oh, yeah.
Like books and books and books. This is an extremely well-studied topic. And I was wondering, how much is this another reframing?
I mean, this is where the history...
Of something which is really known.
Yeah, no, I would say that the history, quote unquote, here is at its most tendentious. Like, I think that, here's a word which I don't think occurs in Delirious New York at all, which is Chicago.
No.
Which is, like, if you were going to do an orthodox... history of the skyscraper.
His reading of what skyscrapers are is... It's not what they are, actually.
No. If you're doing the actual history of the skyscraper, like, the action's all in Chicago and these kind of early buildings which are getting higher and higher and higher. Before they had a financial crash in the 1890s, which I think slowed it all down a bit. And then you have famous buildings like Burnham and... It's by Burnham and Root, isn't it? The Monadnock building, which is the, like... last and tallest non-steel frame building, where they build it all out of brick, and it has this very, very peculiarly, incredibly thick walls as a result, which is sort of... Yeah. This is a proper subject of architectural history, but it's...
I think in America, and probably in America of the 1970s, an extremely important and revered one. Yeah. The origin of their sort of particular unique contribution to world culture. Yeah. A unique American contribution to world culture.
They got one or two others.
There's many others. I just meant one.
Yeah.
And he completely sidesteps it.
Yeah. He gives it. It's a very because his story is all about New York and it's about the particular genius of Manhattan.
And
anyway,
and also his idea of what a skyscraper is nothing to do with how you make a big tall building.
Yeah.
Make a big tall building work. It's
No.
It's
about how you dream about making one. How you kind of come to possess this like immense kind of sexual dynamism to want to make one happen.
Well,
rather
also, and the particular qualities that they have in Manhattan.
It's not about boring old engineering and how you like join a column onto a beam and all that. So the kind of early skyscrapers that he's talking about at this point are mostly concentrated down the bottom end of Manhattan. So there are this kind of rush of early skyscrapers that get built around and just after the turn of the century, and his origin story for where skyscrapers come from is not in the steel frame or in the property market necessarily, but in these kinds of like dreams. There's an illustration which is actually on the front of a guidebook with this kind of crazy fantastical cityscape, and there's this funny picture of lots of houses on top of each other in a kind of steel-framed stack.
Rem's first sort of skyscraper, which he thinks is the most primitive. We've got a kind of hierarchy, like we'd have in Ruskin or something.
Yeah.
The most primitive form, the pre-form, is you get the site plan and you extrude it to the maximum commercially viable number of floors.
Yeah, and the kind of classic version of that is Burnham and Root's Flatiron building, which is
exciting because it's triangular.
We're looking at a very early, beautiful, very artistic photograph of it in the smog.
They are either straight up extrusions of the site, or extrusions with sort of adjustments to the plan to mean that light can get sufficiently far into the plan, rather more generously than we do now often.
There's a kind of a controversy about these buildings in New York because people think that you shouldn't be allowed to just extrude the site straight up.
By concentrating a lot of building in one spot, there are bad things that building does to the area around it.
Yeah.
Specifically, the light of the area around it.
Yeah.
Like, it destroys local amenity by having that much mass in one place.
A planning-ism.
The person who does it first kind of takes some of the amenity from the surrounding site. With people proposing bigger and bigger buildings, it's acknowledged that some restriction on the right of people to endlessly expand upwards. Also, if you extrude up on the site, on all sides, you're kind of, if your neighbours build up to or do the same thing next to you, they block all your windows.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Which is a problem.
Yeah, so this is obviously the most obvious like early skyscraper typology. He thinks there are two others which are kind of visible. One of which is basically just building. There are people just building big towers as a landmark.
What am I reading?
The classic. What are you reading?
Total Architecture. Sturrott's anti-humanistic proposal reveals the essence of the Manhattan Project, a diagram of temperature and atmospheric regulating tubes that is supposed to emerge from oak panel partitions complete with fireplaces. The outlets of this psychomasmatic battery are key to the scale of experiences that range from the hedonistic to the medical.
Yeah.
The irreversible synthetic pervades every corner. That's a sort of typical example of prose.
Yeah. Koolhaas says that there are sort of three initial kind of typologies in the Manhattan skyscraper. There's multiplication, site extrusion. There's what he calls a lighthouse, and his example of that is the Madison Square Gardens, where they built a kind of 30-odd story tower as a big beacon landmark. And the other one is what he calls an island, which is where they have the site, but they just sort of build a little tower on a bit of it. And I guess the Singer building would also have been an example of that.
Well, the significance of the towers is that if you own a whole block and you develop some of it to a low level and some of it to a big level, you're beginning to develop a different sort of thing from an extrusion of the site.
Yeah.
It's something which can both maximize the amount of floor space, maximize the silhouette, and the sort of visual. I mean, you sell in real estate.
Yeah.
Selling is important. And it also can coexist with its neighbours.
Yeah.
This idea that you can have an impressive landmark which has got a lot of mass at the bottom and then a big tower, is a kind of different way of inhabiting. You don't just have to do one thing.
Yeah, so that's the Metropolitan Life building that we're looking at on that one.
So the significant, what these things are is
Yeah.
the big building's pretty obvious. You extrude it,
Yeah,
or you can have a tower and a small building,
Yeah.
a low building, or you can sort of have the tower and the low building kind of integrate with each other.
yeah. His kind of thesis is all about. So he basically says the Woolworth building is the first integration of these ideas into something which is sort of all of them at the same time. And for people not looking at the picture, it's like extruded up a certain way, and then it gets a bit. Then there's a bit of it which is a kind of tower section, and the extruded bit is pretty high. Like I don't know how many stories that is, about 20, and then the tower bit is also quite large, but it's also quite successfully formally integrated. You've got this like strong vertical piers which kind of run all the way through, and you've got this kind of like way of stressing the corners, which creates a kind of visual continuity.
It was strange for me reading this, because you would think someone who's so interested in architecture would, well, actually wouldn't think it in the case of Rem Koolhaas, but a different person who also wasn't doing a conventional history of skyscrapers might talk about how this thing functions formally, which is that if you took the tower off the top, it would still be a tower.
Yeah.
And the tower on the top functions to generate prestige and silhouette.
Yeah.
You can put some expensive stuff in it, but really the floor plan is all in the big fat bulk at the bottom, not in the fine spike on the top. But the fine spike on the top makes it very tall and very prominent.
Yeah.
And you can do some sort of prestige with that. And so the way that functions as a bit of real estate is pretty clear. I don't think Rem's super interested in that. It's slightly hard to work out what he is talking about, because because it's all hiding behind this thick goopy prose.
I mean, it's sort of, so there's a bit, I think it's around this bit he talks about, there is like so American architects at this time were basically all educated in the Beaux-Arts, but then happened to be working on this type of building that has no place at all in the classical understanding of architecture. Like there's no place for the skyscraper in that sort of historicist like structure, and they obviously find a way of making it work, but there is a real stylistic problem, which he does talk about a little bit. He says like
that problem he does talk about,
like there's the buildings are absolutely massive, but they're not monumental in the sense of they don't like properly, and you do see this in there's a book which is of kind of advice for students, American students at the Beaux-Arts, which I've got somewhere around here, and which also has some kind of student projects, and one of them is like a monumental scheme for Lower Manhattan, and it's an obelisk that's like 500 meters tall with no windows, and it's a kind of, you could see it as this very obvious like attempt to work out a proper way to create a kind of monumental order in this thing which has already arisen. Anyway, that's like a silly tangent.
Yeah, but I mean, Koolhaas doesn't quite say these are products of the demands of real estate. Okay, you've got to just sell all these units stacked on top of each other. That's a commercial block.
No, because he wants to treat it as architecture. What he does say is that he says that this is a radical, morally traumatic break with the conventions of symbolism, in which the building is like celebrating only the fact of its disproportionate existence, the shamelessness of its own process of creation.
And I think what that is he's talking about the bits of Beaux-Arts that are stuck on the big tower block.
But he's very excited by the transgressiveness of this in terms of like architectural ethics, or kind of an architecture of like values. People are doing something which, properly speaking, is kind of immoral in terms of the ethics of the architecture at the time, but it's giving birth to something new and exciting through that act of like transgression. It's very, I mean, this is very much his sort of thing, isn't it? It's like,
I mean, this feels like
it's like rock and roll, isn't it? Like it's trying to make architecture rock and roll. It's trying to make it punk. It's trying to find a way for. know.
I didn't find that super convincing.
Well,
But he does have. So I mean, he's sort of discussing the way in which the architects of the time struggled with putting kind of Beaux-Arts details and bits on big extruded repetitive lumps.
yeah,
And how they didn't think that was the most beautiful thing.
yeah,
And in a way, these towers looked at on their own are not the most beautiful thing. It's like one extrusion, even one that's quite well judged is a sort of extrusion on top of another extrusion.
yeah,
They're interesting in that they're big and monumental.
Yeah.
The Beaux-Arts stuff on them doesn't contribute very much at all. It's
Yeah.
sort of nicety.
And then the flip side of it is also that you can have these interiors which don't have any particular reference to the exteriors, which he talks about as this kind of radically new development. So that you have these sort of strange, again, kind of theme park like fantasies on the inside. He talks about these this like restaurant and club design called Murray's Roman Gardens, which is this sort of classical fantasy inside. I actually can't remember which. I don't think this is inside a skyscraper, in fact, but it's for what he thinks is this kind of very novel idea of like a sort of totally floating kind of interior fantasy thing, which is inside an essentially like arbitrary envelope. And that one, one is the
inside a sort of low build. But the ideal thing that Rem Koolhaas would like this to be is that you have a skyscraper tower, and within that tower you have, like his diagram, which is kind of country houses all built differently on kind of gantries of a big steel frame.
Yeah.
The interior is completely different, is completely arbitrary what's in it. And it can have a fake image of Rome in the middle of a skyscraper. That you can have a completely enclosed interior in which anything can go on, and it can be very different, like not make any sense. The examples he gives are not quite actually, he's kind of having to ram them quite hard into the box that they don't fit in, but that's the case he's making, which is that they're experimenting at this time with an architecture of fantasy where you can go, where you have a city on the outside which is kind of made of these big masses, and then inside there can be anything. It's a jungle inside these towers. They're full of Roman orgies and interior forests, and not at all full of rows and rows of identical offices.
Yeah. Okay. So the big break is the adoption of this zoning law, where essentially they don't want any more of these buildings which rise straight up off the street for tens and tens of stories. And I think this is broadly still how the size of buildings in New York is regulated. You have a notional kind of zoning envelope for the block. It's got a certain height.
It's quite generous.
Yeah. It's still quite big. And then these are drawn up in as this famous series of illustrations by a guy called Hugh Ferris, who's an architectural painter of the time, which are very amazing, dramatic images in which the permissible envelope is visualized as this sort of prismatic form lit by crepuscular light thrown into dramatic light and shadow. There's a sort of evolution as well in which he kind of hypothesizes about how the form of a building will evolve out of these new envelopes into broadly like ziggurat language.
Yeah, essentially the New York block is several times wide. It's a rectangle that's like 3 square or something like that.
Yeah,
they're not all the same.
Long. Yeah,
the envelope allows you to go vertically up for a while, and then you have to go back at an angle. I mean, quite a steep one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more than 60 degrees, maybe.
Yeah, it looks like sort of 70 degrees, doesn't it?
And there are various restrictions which sort of serrate that edge.
Yeah.
And then the core of the block is allowed to be extruded indefinitely.
Yeah.
And the first step of just drawing and rendering that envelope in light does something very Koolhaasian, which is that it says we've got a law which, like his notion of the grid, we're going to extend this out to the end of the island.
Yeah.
We've got an envelope which is infinitely tall.
Yeah.
And then at the base has a very complicated, craggy form.
Yeah.
And that immediately begs the question of what do you do with a city full of these? This
Yeah.
thing is massive. And
Yeah, it's almost
with that, I really don't feel that he's having to reach.
no.
I think the heavy lifting is really being done by the renderer.
Yeah, in a way, like actually, his reading of the grid is like reading the grid through the logic of Hugh Ferris.
Yeah.
In reverse, like it's yeah. I mean, what
Hugh
Fer-
Ferris, who is this architectural renderer, he actually has found someone who does have
Yeah.
a wild utopian vision. If not utopian, a wild megalomaniacal vision
Yeah.
for how the future can be, which is that you just, the first thing you do, okay, that's the limit, we will just maximize it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then from the maximum, you rationalize.
It's almost like a reading of, it's like a generative reading of the zoning diagram, isn't it? It's like,
Yeah.
like these are the parameters, and this is this is what the building will end up looking like based
Yeah.
on a kind of
And there are various stages.
yeah.
So it's generative, but it like takes as its basis essentially the maximum permissible form. And the first approach is rationalizing that
Yeah.
to a single block.
Yeah.
You can kind of, okay, so we've got to kind of make this into more of an architectural shape. You
Yeah.
can make it into more of a ziggurat. It's probably going to have
Yeah.
flat bits.
It's as if it's
vertical,
kind of
horizontal
it's as
roofs.
if it's becoming it's as if it's becoming kind of pragmatic from the bottom up.
Yeah.
Like the bottom bit is being sculpted and these kind of creating these kind of cutaways to let light deeper into the plan and things like that.
So he has this proposal for the single site,
Yeah.
which is done in 4 steps, and ends up with a building which is like a kind of massively tall version of
I like this the penultimate step when it's like super steppy.
which is where you just make into floor plates.
Yeah.
Except for he doesn't quite have the daring to. He does 2 things. He kind of makes it into floor plates, so everything's
Yeah.
got flat roofs, and then he puts a top on the infinite tower.
Yeah, they look like it
You
looks
didn't
like
have to put that top of that infinite tower. You could have just kept that.
Yeah, yeah. The tower can't actually be infinitely tall in his view, but these bits look like a kind of Aztec temple on the wings, don't they? It's, and then
And then it's starting to look rather like Giles Gilbert Scott or something.
yeah, it's got a real bit of Bankside Power Station about it.
But then there's a next step, which is, okay, what if we just make the whole city out of these?
Yeah.
What if we have a landscape which is just composed of this, not just of these envelopes, but these envelopes rendered
Yeah,
in chiaroscuro charcoal, but as if they were, I don't know, made of white stuff lit
Yeah.
by a spot lamp.
so the book, I think it's called The Metropolis of Tomorrow. There's like a short book that Ferris did with lots and lots of these renderings in. It's really great. You can maybe we can link to it. You can get it on archive.org. Yeah, I mean this looks like like an expressionist utopia or something, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it is
Those like crystal chain guys.
yeah. They would have been into this.
Crystal necklace
Yeah.
all over it, guys. Doesn't feel like a big step from expressionism, does it?
Yeah.
Like, and it's bigger.
Yeah, it's bigger.
Like
and
he
also
has-
it's on a grid plan.
Yeah, he's got this idea of
Yeah.
this just huge scale. Like,
Yeah. Imagine if expressionist architecture also made good,
was deeply authoritarian.
yeah, well, like had good GDV, like what made sense, was lendable.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that's what this image is about. This image is really about
It's about a dream, isn't it?
this really pointy landscape.
Yeah, there's some other. I don't think I put that many of them in, but these other great images of like him in his studio looking out at this kind of imaginary.
Well, I think the
landscape
one
and
with
things
the
like that.
do you have the one with the figure in the landscape?
I
which
don't
is
think I
like,
do.
Man,
Yeah, I don't have it, but
it's,
we can.
I can describe it
Yeah.
from memory.
Yeah.
Which is that it's a kind of Superman figure, and
Yeah.
he's weirdly in a field with a little cottage next to him in rolling hills, but in the background is a kind of dream megalopolis
Yeah.
of these lit
Yeah.
planning forms,
Yeah.
which are actually jumbled. They don't quite take on the grid. It really is, it's an assembly of these massed forms. Under that dark sky, which is the void that he's always talking about,
Yeah.
that Rem Koolhaas is always talking about, that is a kind of dream landscape that he thinks is one of the energies that Manhattan is
Yeah.
moving towards.
It's a really fascinating set of images, actually, which I think like we could definitely make more use of it than Koolhaas does. There's a bit. One of the visions I quite enjoy is this one where the top of the buildings are all kind of like acropolises. There you have these sort of freestanding Greek temples, and also the kind of cascading slopes sort of have steps and sort of wide paved areas and things. And it's very much like it's a kind of vision of this sort of like sunlit Athenian sort of civic space up on top of all of these new mega buildings.
Yeah, and that feels to be reaching towards something which Koolhaas does acknowledge, but he doesn't want to make the point here. He wants to make a point about pure energy.
Yeah.
And this is a kind of point which is going towards a bit like, I guess it feels like a little bit like that sometimes in Tokyo, where is the ground? You're existing in like different levels of this built landscape. And it's a great future vision of that. And in a way, though, there's a problem with that image, and you can see why he didn't use it, which is that it's a perfectly acceptable Beaux-Arts realization of what that city could be like.
Yeah.
Which runs contrary to Rem Koolhaas's shtick.
And then there are various other ones that he talks about. There's, there are people who think that the block should sort of be kind of cut away more, that really the blocks should be much more consolidated into these kind of point blocks, point towers, enabling more of the block to be kind of liberated for parkland and that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, but they're point blocks, but it's a long way, and it's a crucial distinction from the Le Corbusier block and jungle.
No, it's not.
Which
not
is
like
that like maybe the parks account for 10% of the land, 20% is towers, and the rest is roads and low rise.
Yeah. But that's that sort of concept.
Which has a very different street.
Yeah, and then there's this other aspect of the kind of fantasy alongside the fantasy of the kind of envelope maximizing ziggurat skyscraper is this idea that he characterizes as Venice, a kind of like Venetian dream of the city to come, which is all about these kind of connecting walkways, which are almost like a kind of Beaux-Arts version of the megastructure or something like this, which comes up in people.
Streets in the sky.
Yeah, lots of streets in the sky, lots of like connecting bridges and these things
this
are
metaphor, like Venice, that the water is replaced with
roads,
non-pedestrian roads and trains and things. And then there are pedestrian ways, one or two levels of them.
Yeah.
And
kind of sometimes high level bridges. And these kind of Athenian Acropolis rooftops and
he's not unable to criticize this as well, or criticize implementation of this.
I love these visions. I think are very attractive. These there's a guy called Harvey Wiley Corbett who produces some of these, as well as actually being an architect. At this point, the skyscraper has kind of become a mature thing. It's this idea. It's surrounded by this idea of this like rich potential and this intense excitement about the future of the city. And there are one or two. I think we've slightly undersold these. He's introduced the idea of what he calls the lobotomy, which is like the fact that the inside and the outside don't need to be at all like one another, and the idea that the inside is this kind of pure space of doing whatever you want and is kind of disconnected from the necessity of expression or kind of meaningful connection in any respect to the outside. And then there's a second part of the evolution of the skyscraper, which is it kind of moving towards its like early maturity, where he's going to talk about three classic kind of skyscraper stories in the 20s and 30s. But I think we'll move that second bit of the skyscraper discussion into the.
At this point, I would like to say propose some things that he's thinking about.
Yeah.
Well, like what the skyscraper seems to be heading towards, what it's implied to be heading towards at this point, which is that there's the struggle with Beaux-Arts conscience, which is that people have been trained as an architectural culture designing buildings that look like traditional buildings from before the super dense city.
Yeah.
and how you express that on a building, or what that even means. And he does acknowledge that actually that most of what people are talking about in architecture isn't skyscrapers at this time. In spite of the fact that I'm sure in the popular imagination of New York at this time, skyscrapers are immensely important.
Yeah.
But they're not super prestigious. The form of a skyscraper is not an extrusion. It's something where tall masses, blocks, kind of exist with relation to the roads of the block.
Yeah.
So it has this kind of stepping back shape. And it also, for him, has various things which mean that it is multifunctional.
Yeah.
Where, in fact, many towers can have principally one function, the ideal skyscraper, I think, for him, is a congested one. And a congested skyscraper is a skyscraper in which a multitude of different activities and movement exist within the building as well as without the building. And he talks about how in an ideal building, I can't remember who's proposing this, but, you can live... Essentially, the building is a village or a town. It has employment of different categories, living, the amenities for the hours of repose. It's another kind of dig at the theories of the modernist city, which are about separation.
It's a dig at the modern, definitely the modernist theory of the city, and it's also like a very clear dig. So what he calls the culture of congestion, this idea that each building can contain a multitude of different private realms, kind of often shared private realms, each of which can express its own ideology, each of which can be in a way like a kind of conceptual and ideological like island within the city. And that's all possible because of this idea of kind of smashing everything together. It's a very clear dig at like Marxist historians as well. And
but as well as like Robert Moses and like motorway planners, right?
Yeah, but
he's still on the Jane Jacobs side in some ways.
Sure, I think that, so like there are a lot of people at this point who are like very preoccupied with the effect of ideology on the city and trying to locate their kind of architectural response as, having a certain sort of criticality in its response to a city which is conditioned by like capitalist ideology. And his whole kind of idea of like the culture of congestion is like, no, we don't need to worry about all of that. Like anything's possible inside the world of the skyscraper. There's room for everything. There is this kind of multitude, and like this idea of like, far from being the most potent expression of the operation of like capitalism, actually paradoxically, to use a very Koolhaasian word, the skyscraper creates the possibility of this like incredible like liberation and like diversity.
I mean, that's obviously like not right.
Yeah. Is whether it's right the right way to judge this book? I mean, it's like you say, it's a paranoid reading. It's incredibly like extreme, and it goes beyond like doing violence to the evidence to, just kind of do whatever with the evidence. It's all about making an amazing story. And
yeah. But anyway, that's what here's something that's useful. I know we're wrapping this episode up, but I think a way that I think about it is I've never been to America. I've certainly never been to New York. And so it is a fantastical place. It's a place that exists in like films and TV and description. It's the glowing white hot city beyond the shrinking Atlantic.
Yeah.
And it's a city that's produced so many images of itself. And he is producing an image. It cannot possibly be real.
Yeah.
His skyscraper is a jungle on the it's like or it's like Babylon on the inside.
Yeah. It's
not cubicles and little flats.
No. It's not like
for rich people.
No. I would or it's not like
not suspended ceilings, acres of homogeneity.
Have you seen the film The Apartment, which is a 1950s film? Anyway, the guy in that works in like a big office in a tower, and it's big grid. Everyone has their like calculating machine, essentially like everybody is,
Yeah.
adding everything up and then everything kind of calculating. I think I might have misremembered this, but I think that in it the elevator is the boss's office and he like goes up and down observing.
Like someone's badger.
Yeah, I think I might have made that up. I think I remember that being the case. You sort of see him like slowly ascending.
It was a kind of, yeah. And we'll end in describing this image, which is that there was a ball held annually at one or other architectural association.
Yeah.
I forget which one. And normally they were with Beaux-Arts topics. But one year the representation was for sort of modernity or the future. And various important architects dressed up as buildings, but they all dressed up sort of as skyscrapers. And even the people who hadn't worked on any skyscrapers dressed up as a skyscraper and then wore their building as a hat on top of the skyscraper.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of metaphor which is something that Rem Koolhaas is able to make a great play of.
Yeah.
What all this means. I mean, it's a sort of jolly thing.
Yeah.
And the Chrysler building guy's got the best outfit, which is made of wooden veneers. And he's sort of dressed in a wizard's outfit made of wood.
It looks amazing. Yeah. It's a real good. Yeah. Yeah.
And look at the image and hold that in your mind until we return.
Yes. So thanks very much for listening. We will return with our exploration of the
second half of the book.
Second half of the book very soon. We'll be posting images on our social media at about_buildings on various platforms. And we'll at some point do some bonus content as well, which is available on our Patreon, which is a crowdfunding platform where you can support the podcast and give us money. All the links to anything that you might want to find are on our website at aboutbuildingsandcities.org. Thanks very much for listening.
And good night.
And night.